Week. Sonoma State University student Shelby Wade created Sonoma State Social Justice Week, and it launched in 2015. The goal is to provide a space for not only the Sonoma State student body, but the community as well, and to contribute ideas, gain perspective, and get an understanding of current social justice issues. Its mission is to connect students with advocates who help students develop theoretical understanding of whose land SSU sits upon and the power of grassroots activism for human betterment and social change, while raising student and community awareness of and engagement with issues embedded in societal social cultures of inequality, colonialism, imperialism, classism, ableism, sexism, patriarchy, heterosexism, queerphobia, transphobia, xenophobia, and religious and other discrimination. Involve students in social justice issues, as well as to involve students in social justice issues and organizations which produces socially responsible students, community engagement, and contributes to equitable distribution of economic, political, civil, cultural, social, and other resources and opportunities in society in order to promote personal, campus, and community development. And now I'd like to acknowledge the land that we're on. Long before California, Sonoma County, and Sonoma State, and the land around us was inhabited by indigenous peoples collectively known as the Coast Miwok and Southern Pomo. Now they are formally recognized as the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria and chaired by Greg Saris, who also holds the Great Rancheria Endowed Chair at SSU. Sonoma State acknowledges in gratitude the Rancheria's ancestors for their stewardship of the land and all of its resources, and thank the current membership for their partnership in a number of educational initiatives, including the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria Learning Center at the Fairfield Osborne Preserve located on Sonoma Mountain. As Professor Saris writes in his 2017 book, How a Mountain Was Made, it is said that Coyote was sitting atop Sonoma Mountain when he decided to create the world and people, but that is part of the big story of the mountain. We are now all part of the big story of the mountain, and our stewardship of its resources, including our country and our university, is an ongoing, vital responsibility we recognize and gladly accept. I'm Stacy Weddick, and I'll be your host today. I'm a fourth-year psychology student, and I'll be graduating this spring. And I'm pleased to announce our speaker, Stephen Vicente Arevalo. His bio is quite extraordinary. Stephen is an Esselen, Rumsen, Ohlone, Cochiti Pueblo descendant, as well as a public speaker, culture bearer, shadow worker, Aboriginal medicine man, and a father of four. He'll be touching on topics consisting of California Aboriginal history and how it all amalgamated into the foster care system, the prison system, the sex trafficking, and missing murdered Indigenous women today. I will now read our ground rules. The first part of the session will be the presentation, and you will have a chance to interact during the second part, which will be a Q&A, which will be around 25 to 30 minutes. And as part of our continuing commitment to social justice work, when we experience examples of oppression, we will speak up. This means we can interrupt the meeting and draw the issue to one another's attention, and we will do this kindly, with care, and in good faith. This statement is a reminder that we commit to do this in the service of ending oppression. And the consequences of violating the ground rules will be warnings, and hecklers will not be tolerated and will result in the instant removal from the session. Please respect other people's contributions, and we will not tolerate any derogatory nor hateful language and actions. Thank you for coming, and please fill out an evaluation form online or on paper for each event you attend at Sonoma State Social Justice Week. And here's Stephen.
Salaki Itsu, Nishismap Stephen Arevalo, Iu Iwano, Sarhentaruk Tukutnu Eshilat, Iune Esselen, Romshen, I Cochiti Pueblo. Good evening, my name is Stephen Arevalo. I'm a descendant of the Rumsden, Cochiti Pueblo, and Esselen people. I come from the village sites of Sarhentaruk, Eshilat, and Tukutnu, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to speak on California Aboriginal history, how it pertains and how it's amalgamated through time into all these injustice systems that are in place now here in California, and how it all started from the enslavement of my own ancestors. The system is obviously well established. We know that it's been around for a while. It's countrywide, but specifically in California, California's whole history was based on the prison system and imprisonment of indigenous people. Without that being done, California wouldn't be a state today. And so kind of touch base on pre-contact information, things that were happening before contact with the Spanish, was an open relationship with creating source, an open relationship with the source energy, or what most people describe as creator or God. There was no enslavement to that. There was no borders and putting things in a box in a religious context. There was the beliefs were passed orally for generations. We didn't have a written scripture or anything like that. That was all given to us afterwards. Another thing that was happening before contact was polygamous relationships. It wasn't until after enslavement that we were taught not to be polygamous and practice polygamy, that we were taught monogamy. It was also for a reason, and that was specific to our enslavement, because when a man had multiple women, it had to deal with trade route. And Europeans knew that when they came over here. And that's why when they came to this state, as they were coming through, they would marry in or coalesce with our women. And that is because they understood that in order to have trade, you have to have offspring with the village. And so this is why we have a large mixed race population here in the continent now. They call us Métis or Mestizo, or any of those other mulatto, any of those other amalgamated terms, which all are reference to different degrees of Indian percentage. And so without that practice of polygamy being destroyed and monogamy being in place, the generation of mixed indigenous European stock wouldn't have never existed without that. Because traditionally, the women chose the strongest man, the hunter. And so you weren't choosing the guy who couldn't hunt. If he couldn't provide for you, you theoretically don't want a guy who can't provide for you or protect you. And so monogamy actually opened it up for quote unquote the weaker men, the non alpha men of the village, to now have access to women, when normally that naturally wouldn't happen, because you can't provide for yourself. Even if you're not able to provide for yourself, you're not able to provide for a family. If you can't lead yourself, you can't lead a village. And so that was all destroyed during our enslavement, during first contact. They literally physically destroyed all those leaders. So when you hear about population within the mission system itself and the enslavement and the number count of how many people were enslaved, what they don't tell you is that there was a lot of bodies left in the fields from the villages that were being raided, mostly elder males, warrior males, males that would actually put up a fight. This is why they were dead. The whole mission system of California, from San Diego all the way up to San Francisco, was built on the back of young adolescent males and elder women and children, mostly females. A lot of people don't understand, but women built the mission system. A lot of people were crushed by grabbing boulders from the rivers and trying to carry these things in order to build these churches. People were crushed with their legs, crushed their heads. There's a lot of people died just building these buildings. Mostly, again, women and children. There weren't any able-bodied males. All able-bodied males were elders 60 and above within the mission system. So in order to destroy our culture and in order to destroy the equilibrium, pre-contact equilibrium, they did a lot of ideology stripping, or amalgamating ideology, things that we would normally see as our culture. They would amalgamate it into Catholic culture. They would switch it slowly but surely to make you think you're still practicing your culture, when in all actuality, you're being conquered. And they were really good at this. They were really good at disguising and forcibly doing it, blatantly forcibly converting us. But they would do it in such a passive aggressive situation. They would befriend, they would learn the language. This is all reconnaissance. They're gathering information on us before they really set the plan of attack and conquer. And this is what they've been doing since they got on the continent. This is what they did in Mexico City. This is what they did in Peru, and with the major kingdoms and empires. It was much easier to destroy us. We were still hunter-gatherers. We weren't part of the greater conglomerate of those civilized tribes. There was no formal marriage within our system. So that was another thing that kind of altered us, is that within our ancestral practice, we were free-flowing people. There was no idea of marriage. There was no idea of divorce. You can be with whoever you want to be when you want to be with them. And then when you choose that you're done with them, you could choose to move forward with your life. The idea of marriage and property and all that came way later, mostly during the mission period, and then for sure later on into the Anglo period when marriage was really pushed lot harder. The Spanish didn't really push it, but they would force us, they would force marry different village sites. And so there's no California mission Indian that can say I'm 100% Pomo or I'm 100% this and my ancestry's always been this, because they would purposely marry Coast Miwok with Pomo, alone Rumson Olonis with Esselens. Wherever they were within close proximity, they would purposely mix them up. And that had to do with title stripping and land grabbing. If you don't know who you are and you're being taught now you're amalgamated, well, now you just lost the title to your land. And so that's how it really started with us in pre-contact, and how it's amalgamated slowly, surely into this conquering culture, which the Catholics established very soon. So the initial contact happened in 1769. That was when the recons came up. That's when they initially trekked up here. They plotted out San Diego first, and then they plotted out Monterey. San Francisco wasn't plotted out until 1776, when 13 colonies were signing the Declaration of Independence. So 1776, 13 colonies are signing in the East Coast, and San Francisco is literally being built out as a mission and presidio here in San Francisco. So it just gives you a time frame of what's all going on the continent. Within that time, that's the initial contact. That's when we first had our first sexual assaults, our first kidnappings, our first women nappings, sex trafficking at an all-time high. They originally built the mission in Monterey proper, and they had to move it to Carmel because the women were being raped at a rapid rate that the Spanish couldn't refrain, I should say, from having their way with our women. And so they actually had to move the mission clear down into the Carmel area. And even then it was still an issue. Also at the beginning of contact was the major demasculating of the males. So any male who was a fighter, any young male who was between 15 and 19 who thought he was going to rebel, they would demasculate you. They would castrate you. They would purposely violate you as a male and demasculate, make you subservient to the system. A lot of our males chose not to fight. Most of our males were runners and hiders because of the fear that the Spanish were so vicious with the consequences. And so because of the running, there was a lot more running. A lot of our males would run up to the hills for days, do ceremonies and prayers, and then come back down and only free the women. So they used to separate us in the mission because they didn't want us to freely have population. They wanted to control population. So we weren't allowed to have sex with our significant others unless the priest ordained it. We weren't allowed. There was certain rules and regulations to even personal engagement with your spouse. And if a woman was deemed loose or too, out and about with her sexuality, they put them in what we call wooden shoes, which is basically a yoke that goes on both your feet. And so it prevents women from keeping their legs, having their legs open. But they would keep you in this for like 72 hours, maybe a week sometimes. So you would see people literally working with these yokes on their feet, and they're like defecating and like urinating on themselves because they have nowhere else to go and they can't even like go to the restroom. So it's just really, really harsh conditions for the ancestors. And like I said, a lot of us were runners. So there was a whole population and generation of people just in wooden yokes on their feet. And so they would be sitting there. I don't know if anybody's ever seen them, but you'll see images of women and children where the children are playing, but the woman's literally stuck with the yoke on her feet, and she's like weaving basket or working some other slave, chore at that time or whatever they had to do. Polygamy was destroyed. As soon as contact happened, they definitely did away with that. All the men that were of essence who had multiple women, you couldn't have those multiple women. There's an example in the mission system at Carmel. He was a chief of Point Lobos, I believe, around Point Lobos area. It's called Ishenta. And he was a man of essence, a man of power, and he had multiple wives. They were sisters, which was common practice. So he had married some sisters, and or went through a ceremony and had his wives or spouses at the time, and the Catholics didn't like it, so he was flogged, severely flogged. I think they gave him like 250 lashings, I think was written down. And so he waited until he was well and healed up by the women who healed him. And he decided to start a rebellion. He's the only one who started a rebellion in the Monterey area. And his name was Baltazar. He died in the Santa Lucia mountain range fighting the Spanish and having anti-colonial propaganda, spreading it around the Indian population. But it's interesting that even polygamy was our spark for our rebellion. It was short-lived. The rebellion was squashed and squandered, and no one fought after that. But it all started from the idea of, you're not going to take advantage of our women. You're not going to keep our women from us. We're going to have our own women, and you can deal with the women you're bringing over. The Spanish obviously didn't like that, and killed off those fighting warriors. Passing women around started becoming so norm that 2 generations after contact, women started passing themselves around. Sex trafficking culture, prostitution culture was established very early on here in California, and mostly Indian women. So you wouldn't see a lot of European women or Spanish women at the garrisons or at the Presidio. It was all Indian women. And so we learned these behaviors. We learned behaviors as males of, hey, you can have my wife for the night. We learned behaviors of the wives being like, I'm going to go sleep with this man so that he doesn't kill my husband. And this slowly but surely amalgamated into the issues we have today with MMIW, objectifying Native women. We're so colonized, we started objectifying our own women, and our women started objectifying themselves because colonization rots our brain. And so we know this. We know that in order to build civilization, you have to destroy a lot of things. Literally, like to build this building here, how much wood did it take? How many rocks did it take to crush to make concrete? And in order to build society, you have to destroy culture. You have to destroy village in order to build cities. And so that's what they did. They destroyed every village they could possibly destroy to build these little garrisons and cities or whatever. And we, like I said, we learned it ourselves. We started doing it to ourselves. We started abusing ourselves. Our women learned quick that sex holds value, and that, even till this day, like it's promoted heavy, that this whole sex culture, and this all begins with enslavement. This all begins with, I could go further back into history. This goes back into Egyptian times, Roman times. Every time an empire is conquered, they call it the spoils of war or the booty. And that's why they call it that. It's not just gold, it's physical women. When you won wars, you were able to coalesce and start a whole new population of servants and people for the kingdom. And so that's what they were doing. They would literally conquer areas, and they wouldn't care about male slaves. They weren't worried about that. They were worried about how many concubines I got, how many people can I impregnate, because they needed more servants. So they needed generations to come. And so this is why they established, if the mother was a slave, then the kids are slaves for lives, perpetual enslavement through the mother lineage. And that has to deal with matriarchy. They understood matriarchal society. They understood that in order to even have a fur trade in Canada, you had to marry those women up there. That's why they even had access to fur trade. And so same thing here. Our males and sons started to mimic the Spanish culture. So this is later on in generations, you will hear about male Indians pimping out their significant other, or pimping out other people from the village in order to survive, or in order to make some type of extra money, or in order to just perpetuate the culture that's been taught. A lot of people just didn't know any better. And so we started, as males, we started treating our women, we started objectifying our own women, and in turn, treating them with less respect, objectifying them. And that had to do with our own demasculation, because if we were still masculated as men, there was no way we would actually turn our own women into victims. But we started victimizing our own women due to the fact that we were victims, and the abused will abuse the next. And so it was a vicious cycle that still runs to this day within our community. We have men that are, I hate to use the term toxic masculine. I would say misguided and not knowing proper instruction and original instruction to what male role. And again, we get back into that talk. That's a whole different talk too, but what traditional roles were within our society, specifically our tribe, not general, because everybody's different. Every culture was different. Everybody had their own idea of an alpha male and an alpha woman. And so it's all regional difference when it comes to that. Another thing that happened during this time, during the mission period and into what they call secularization, or when Mexico got it, and all the way into the 1850s and statehood, was the outlaw of what they call the pochli, which is the warrior top knot. So traditionally we call them now ducktails, but that's actually an indigenous haircut. And so they, in the as early as the 1600s, clear into the 1850s, they started outlawing this particular haircut because it had to do with warrior society, and warriors wore those cuts. Warriors wore the top knot, and it's actually had nothing to do with being a warrior itself. It had to do with having that tail in the back of your head was as significant, and it signified your cosmic umbilical cord. So as you cut your umbilical cord from your mother, this is why indigenous people didn't cut their top knot. They could cut all the way around their head, but that part right above their crown, they kept that. And that was to tie into this cosmos. That was the umbilical cord to the cosmos. And so they started outlawing this particular cut. They also outlawed the use of rendered animal fat in our hair. That's also known as the Greaser Act. So the greaser, people kind of use that term very loosely as like a derogatory term towards Mexicans, when in all actuality, it was identifying Indians, people that were deemed still using rendered animal fat in their hair, or now they use pomade or whatever, but it was the same thing. It was mostly that top knot was mostly worn by warriors, priests, and nawales, or shapeshifters. And so it was easily identified the type of people that were wearing this. So a lot of our ancestors stopped wearing our top knot, not only because it was illegal, but because it was an identifying mark. It was outlawed as early as the 1600s. A lot of people speak on the presidios as these just things that Spanish actually established to protect the Spanish colony, when in all actuality, they were garrisons and prison camps all at once. When a bad Indian acted up or didn't do what they were told, they were sent to the presidios, and the labor got worse. So it went from just farming and feeding the people that are also enslaved to physical labor, torture, more demasculation. They would mutilate. They would literally mutilate people. There's people that talk about, my great grandfather was missing an arm from the Spanish, or missing a hand, or so you would, it behooves you to do whatever you're being told, or, there's consequences. In 1848, California was officially given with a bunch of other states to the United States. Mexico had lost pretty much a lot of Southwest United States. And that began a whole new wave of torture, torment, and annihilation for our people. The Spanish eventually stopped killing us and decided that they were going to breed us for more slave work. So we still had a population clear into the 1850s. It wasn't until statehood that they really pressed down on California indigenous people and started really literally shooting us like squirrels on the road. And that has to deal with the Greaser Act of 1855. It has to deal with the act of extermination in 1850, pretty much 1851. I believe the first governor of California was the one who stated that we all needed to disappear, and that it was up to them that it was their responsibility to kill us off. A lot of people don't know, but the first prisons were the mission systems, the garrisons, and it eventually amalgamated into the actual first modern prison, which is San Quentin. So San Quentin is the first prison ever built here, and it's built by third generation slaves, Indian slaves, as well as the dregs of New Spain. The people the people who, the undesirables, the guys who, the Spaniards that didn't want to be Spaniards no more, the Indians who didn't want to be slaves, they all were shipped. They were all put on prison ships at first. Before San Quentin was even built, they would house prisoners on ships at Point San Quentin. And those people that were imprisoned at the ships actually built the prison of San Quentin. After that, there was a massive roundup during the 1850s. They were either exterminating Indians or they were rounding them up. I have two great uncles who wound up in San Quentin on trumped up charges. They gave them life sentences, but yet they only served 2 years, which was really interesting to get a life sentence and serve 2 years. I've never heard of that, but it goes to show you that the charges were trumped up and that they were just finding excuses for slave labor, and that the slavery system has amalgamated and it's still amalgamating. We call them modern day jobs now. Yeah, there was a massive roundup and imprisonment of the Indian mixed population as well as the Spanish speakers, because everybody that was coming in were not Spanish speakers. There was also mass hangings in California for Spanish speaking people, all the way through the Southwest, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. If you spoke Spanish, you were pretty much marked for termination. And so there's a whole population of people and a whole generation of those descendants who chose not to speak Spanish at all. They chose to speak English full time, and they lost culture through language because of the fear of extermination. With the men in prison, everybody's getting rounded up. That just leaves it wide open for the women to be violated. There's no one home to protect. So now there was a whole another generation of women being raped within the 1850s and into the early 1900s. And it's talked about within our own community. Even the women they're so used to being used that you'll find like Rumsden Dictionary where it's like really vulgar talk, and it has to do with the sex culture that was going on. And it's interesting as well as sad, because you know where the talk's coming from. You know they're only talking like that because they're being objectified, because they're being forced to coalesce with people they don't want to coalesce with. And so as much as it was gratifying to find the language itself, it was very depressing to find the context of the language in which was saved. And a lot of it had to do with subservience, slave talk, as well as sexual slave talk. How can I please you? Is this okay? Just weird stuff. And that was actually recorded, which was really weird as well. Another thing that happened was the Indian boarding schools, which were established literally about 52 years after statehood. So within those 52-year gap, that was because they didn't know what to do with Indian kids, but they would still use Indian kids for servitude, mostly as like servants or field workers, cattle workers. This is the term cowboy, vaqueros. That's usually the younger boys that are being forced to do the ranch work, branding cattle and all that good stuff. And so the Indian boarding schools, which there are only 3 in California, there was only 3 of them. They actually were still in use up until 2007. And I don't think a lot of people even understand that. Like, we had Indian boarding schools until 2007. That's sickening. The idea that someone can legally take your kid and put him in a school forcibly in 2007, not in 1702, not, you know, I mean, this is, and so it goes to show how much nothing has really changed. The titles have changed. We don't call it mission system, we call it prison system. And we don't call it Indian boarding schools, we call it foster care. And it's theoretically the same exact thing. Nothing new. 1853 is when modern foster care, literally 3 years after statehood, modern foster care was actually established. It was mostly established because of the child labor and the child situation, the orphan children in New York, the overpopulation of orphan children, but it trickled down here in California very fast. And so just like the orphan train where they were shipping children all over the place, they were doing that with our people as well. And they were literally snatching kids that weren't orphaned here. So the difference between the New Yorker kids is they were really running the streets and they were really orphans. Here they weren't. They were still amongst their village and they were being snatched from their mom and dad. and being forced to not only be sexual objects, most of the little girls and some of the boys, but mostly physical labor, maids, servants, uh, ranch hands, things like that. And it was legal. It was technically legal, I think, until like the 1950s or 60s, where you can basically buy an Indian kid for servitude still. Um, it's really horrific to even think that someone can buy your children, and then your children could just, I mean, if you think about it in modern times, no one could even fathom that. No one could fathom, hey, let me knock on the door and take your child from you, and now your child's my slave. Um, that wouldn't necessarily blow over too easy nowadays, but it technically does happen. This is what the foster care system is. A lot of the foster care kids are trafficked kids. They're lost in the system. I was born in the system, literally born in the system. I grew up in the system. I graduated high school in the system. Um, I I think I lived with my biological parents for 3 years of my whole life. And that was brief, really brief in my life. Um, because I was so institutionalized that my parents didn't even want me anymore. That they were like, we can't handle this kid. He's already institutionalized. So they gave me back to the system at 15. And then I maxed out at 19 and got out the system. Um, and it was literal servitude. I've never been to a group home where I didn't have to do physical labor. I've never been to a group home um, where it was like it's just prison. It's another prison system. It's just another way to lock a bunch of people up and make them do what you want them to do, which is pretty much physical labor. Just like in the prison system, they're making inmates build washers, dryers, refrigerators, Victoria's Secret underwear. You'd be surprised how much stuff is made from the prison system, how much stuff we take for granted and we don't even know. You know, ignorance is bliss, but the washing machine you're using is made by somebody who's done 20 years plus in the prison system. The refrigerators, the heating systems, the swamp coolers, all those things are made by prisoners. And there's probably other industries that are tapped into the prison system, but it's all cheap labor. And that's all part of I believe it's the 13th Amendment, where um, slavery is basically legitimized. If you're a vagrant or if you're caught doing a crime, then you could legally become a slave again. And that's what the prison system is. It's legal servitude. Um, Once you're in that system, it's hard to get out. They keep it that way. They need people to be in the system. Um, and so again, nothing has changed. It's the title has changed, but nothing in this state has changed. Um, and so I felt like the best thing to talk about was the fact that we're always amalgamating the same messed up system. And we're always, as a society, trying to better it, but the system is not being bettered. It's just changing title and changing the way it's worked. It's never really worked for us as a people. Um, Servitude's never really worked. Society is obviously showing that it doesn't work. Sorry to say, but we're kind of in a decline right now as a society, as a whole, not just the country, worldwide. We're starting to learn that like civilization just doesn't work as well as we think it is. And that like individualism and family, the way to change something is change within your unit, your actual family unit. If a lot of people change their family unit thinking, then they would change the generational thinking and the generational problems. Um, but we were all brainwashed, all of us, not just indigenous people, not just enslaved people. Everybody that's a citizen and a modern day person has been enslaved to think differently, to think as a slave. And this is what we are in right now, is a state of servitude. We call it civilization, but in order to build civilization, you have to destroy nature. And so we're at this war, we're at this crossroads, whether when it's like, do you want to continue to destroy nature? Or do you want to actually be aware of what's going on and say, hey, we have enough buildings built out, we have enough housing, we can actually house everybody that's in this world right now. We're just choosing not to, over money. Um, we're choosing to keep everybody at a state of servitude. It all has to do with debt and money. And that's been the case since the continent's been colonized. It's all been a debt system. It's all been being paid on the back end, even for them. So the colonizers, the system that's in place, the colonizing system, they're in a hole. They've been in the hole since the beginning of the time. The country's always been in debt. And that's why this corporation has been at war and has only been at peace for 6 years of its existence. This country has literally only been at peace for 6 years. We've been at war since the beginning of this country. Since 1776, with the signing of the Declaration, we've literally been at war. whether it be Indian Wars, Stono, what's the other wars, the Cherokee Wars, the Tuscaloosa Wars, all these wars, including World War I, II, III, we've never been at a time of peace. And that goes to show you that this system is built on servitude, it's built on conquer, build, destroy. And it's been like that since the beginning. It's been like that since even before colonization. This goes back to Roman times. This goes back to when Rome took over. And that's why when you look at your coin, you're still looking at the eagle. Nothing has changed. We just call it the United States, but it's really part of the Roman big empire that we call Rome now. Everybody has their president on one coin, and the flip is the eagle. The eagle took over everywhere. And you'll see that in Byzantine Empire, you'll see that in Mexico, you'll see the eagle always eating the snake. Now, the snake is the original, it's one of the original sources of energy. You'll see snake, serpent worship everywhere. And this has to do with people of the earth. Snakes are close to the earth. Snakes go into the caves, into the cracks. And so with that being said, our people believed in clan system, and within the clan system, snake, alligator, a lot of the reptiles are more your primordial energy sources, whereas mammals and other animals come a little bit later. So indigenous Aboriginal people understood turtle. This is why we call it Turtle Island. The crocodile actually sits under the turtle. There's layers, and they're mostly reptiles. But a lot of snake culture that was being conquered at that time as well. Even for us, we used to have snake society, where the only poisonous snake in California really is that we and have in our area was rattlesnakes. And so we would do a lot of like rattlesnake ceremonies, and they demonized all that. They demonized pretty much anything we did, but they specifically demonized all over the continent snake worship. And then on top of that, mostly because of the way they were conquering with religion and snake being already a bad symbol in their religion, they figured, yo, we got to conquer everybody who's worshiping snakes, and didn't understand that like snakes are primordial energy. The rainbow snake mythology, this or as kids see it, the Jungle Book. You know what I mean? When you go look at Jungle Book, the big snake Khan, it's actually in reference to the rainbow snake, which is a primordial energy, which has been around for a while all over the world. A lot of people pay homage to the rainbow snake. But yeah, the conquering happened, and that was all like an amalgamation of Rome. Once Rome kind of started that wave of conquering, it never really stopped until it reached every continent. And unfortunately, our continent was the last continent that it needed to really reach. A lot of Asia had already conquered themselves. Now they've had multiple layers of conquering all over the world, but the initial conquering, the last bit of it was the Americas. The Europeans never got over here for quite some time. They had actually treaties. A lot of people don't understand that Carthage, Rome, all these big kingdoms actually wrote treaties back then to never come over here. But they were already over here a long, long time ago. This is why if you look up Roman maps, you will see Florida and the Gulf of Mexico on a Roman map. So nothing new with the conquering of the continents. We've all been like moving and migrating and fighting each other. They've recently found reverse side, they've recently found indigenous conquering of Spain. The Basque people, actually, their Indian, their language is actually closely related to Algonquin. A lot of people don't know that even their DNA is closely related to the Algonquins. The Algonquin East Coast Indians also talk about how they traveled to Europe, that they had reconnaissance boats go to Europe. A lot of the narrative about indigenous culture has been suppressed. They say that we weren't sailors. That's not true. We were great sailors. We had ships. We had ships that could hold 200 people. We had big ships. We weren't just these two-person canoe rowers. The idea that like Ohlone people specifically only had these straw boats just weren't true. We were making log boats. There's no way we'd be able to swim in the Pacific Ocean with a straw boat. It would just get destroyed. So it just doesn't make physical sense. And then a lot of what's being taught is not what's being written. And that's the biggest problem for us as indigenous people, is like, it's a lot of sugarcoating. It's a lot of, oh, well, this happened, but it happened this way. And it's like, you can't say that when you have people who've lived, who have ancestors who've lived through, who've also written their side of the story, who've also told their side of the story. And so when we talk about indigenous history, we can't talk about the winning side all the time. And that's usually where we get our narrative, is from the Spanish who won and conquered. So the narrative always comes from that side. We never talk about how it's really affected, and how it trickled down with the effects on us as the enslaved population. For us, it's a touchy subject. It's a very touchy subject to talk about how this all works out, because even within my family unit, I still have people that are perpetually in the system, um, for no apparent reason than generational, like, I don't want to call it a curse, but just generational habits at this point. We're so taught to be either conformists or fugitives. And that's where the term, a lot of people don't understand, but the term cholo actually comes from a Nahuatl term, which means choloa, which means a runaway. So the term cholo was actually in a resistance to indigenous people who ran away from colonization. Choloa meant a runner or a fugitive, and a cholowani meant somebody, the active person who was that person. So the term cholowani actually comes from the term, is a runaway or a fugitive within the feudal system in New Spain, from the encomiendas, from the missions. And so modern cholo has actually adopted that term, but that term is actually a Nahuatl term, which means fugitive. And so when people call, I've been called cholo, I've been called all kinds. I take that as a thing of pride. Like, you're right, I am a fugitive. I do say, I do buck the system. I do buck colonialism. I don't conform to any of the ideology. So I take it as a term of endearment. It's like the best thing going for me. I'm like, yeah, I totally embrace that idea. Um, a lot of like our culture, a lot of the street culture that's in California comes from the prison system, which eventually comes from the Indian systems, the mission systems, gambling, shooting dice. These are all indigenous practices. They do it in the prison system, they do it in the streets, but we actually have paintings in San Francisco in 1860 where people are just hanging out shooting dice and playing games, and we have gambling songs. So why is it demonized now, culture? Why is this culture demonized now? The DuckTales, now it's demonized. It's a street thing, all because of the term cholo, all because of the term fugitive, and people not being conformists. So anything that had to deal with indigenous culture turned out to be looked down upon. Also, like decorating your teeth with jade or lathing your teeth with gold. That's all indigenous practice. That's nothing new to the continent, but it's looked down upon. It's not looked up as noble. But when Europeans came here, they described beautiful women with jade inlaid in their teeth, and men with gold inlaid in their teeth, and how beautiful these people were. And now it's the flip side. They're considered degenerates, dregs of society. They don't look presentable. They're uncouth. They're uncombed. A lot of indigenous tribes wore locks. They don't teach this in school. They teach a bunch of indigenous people with straight, nice hair, but they don't tell you that they used rendered fat to straighten their hair, that their hair naturally wasn't even straight, that it was actually very kinky and curly. If you look up George Catlin's book of 1848, he describes most of indigenous people as having curls in the extreme, not straight hair at all. And so this idea that every Indian had nice, flowy, straight hair that blew in the wind is just an outright lie. A lot of us, including my tribe, we wore locks. We kept locks in our beard. We kept locks in our hair. They describe us as ugly, blackish Negroes in Monterey, California, with locks. And every 35 descriptions of my people, they describe us the same way. Blackish Negroes, the darkest people of California, ugly incontinent, looking like Papua New Guinea, broad nose, thick lip, short and stout, blase, blase. And they describe all of our practices as like less desirable. The only thing that they actually described my people as was really good singers. They're really good singers, but everything other than that was, their culture was, rubbish. And so indigenous culture has been deemed rubbish from the get-go, and is still considered rubbish. And now that it's amalgamated into street culture, it's even worse. Because now a lot of people that are indigenous, they even shun certain practices such as gambling or enlathing your teeth. it's looked frowned upon. And it's like, no, that's actually ancient culture. We should be embracing things like that instead of saying, oh, you're not really Indian if you're doing these things anymore. And it's like, no, indigenous people did these things. We're not indigenous because we're not practicing culture no more. Um, just like in in most street cultures, you throw tobacco on the ground. Naturally, you break your little swisher up and you fill it up and you throw your tobacco on the ground. Well, that's indigenous culture. Your passive, your only thing you're doing different is you're supposed to say a prayer when you put it on the ground. You're, oh, Mateo, and give blessing to the land. We don't do that anymore. We just drop our guts and keep it pushing. But it's all indigenous culture. Um, I could even modern day medical stuff, hypodermic needles, the baby bottle. And when we start talking about how much stuff we've actually put into society, we've put in a lot more into society than what's been taken from. I mean, than what's been given to us credit wise. Um, a lot of what's going on modernly wouldn't have happened without indigenous culture. Running water, saunas, jacuzzis, things like that. This is all we've been doing this. We've been very clean people. We actually taught the colonizers how to clean themselves, and how to properly steam themselves and how to properly sit in a sweat lodge and not only cleanse their body, but cleanse their spirit. There were people that weren't always vicious to us. There were what we call friendlies, who amalgamated into society, our society, who learned our language and married our women. And so it's not always a story of take, and there was no amalgamation of culture. That's simply not true. It was an amalgamation on both sides. As much as we were amalgamating to their culture, they had to amalgamate to our culture in order to uh I would say semi coexist without totally annihilating us, or and I think that's what helped us was a lot of the intermarriages, a lot of the males taking on the women. And then because women are culture bearers, they're teaching their kids indigenous culture. They're not teaching those mixed kids Spanish culture. They don't know what Spanish culture is. They're teaching them traditional indigenous culture. It's up to the father to teach that Spanish culture. So a lot of those mestizo kids actually grew up with indigenous practices more often than not, because the soldier is at the presidio doing his thing as a alpha male protector, and the woman's at home teaching and being the culture bearer traditionally. And so if the woman's indigenous, well, then your kid, whether he's mixed or not, he's growing up as an indigenous person. And so that was pretty much the gist of it for us. It was a lot of initial contact atrocities, and then eventually it eases into like more of a psychological amalgamation than a physical one. They realized that they couldn't physically exterminate us, all of us at least. So they're like the whole terminology of the Indian boarding school, kill the Indian, save the man. And so they tried to amalgamate us into society. And even then it didn't work. A lot of us turned into fugitives and street, what they consider like, I wouldn't say gang members back then because we didn't have gangs, but basically like, just fugitive, somebody who's always on the run, nonconformist, an outlaw, maybe a horse thief. A lot of that was going on where they would just like free the horses or like just cause a ruckus. It would be like guerrilla warfare, set fire to the grain or do other little things, acts of rebellion. And if they got caught, they got tortured. But there was always an act of rebellion. I think there was like 5 accounts of males freeing women, and they would always free the women for some reason, like free all the women and let the women run off. The Spanish always ran after everybody, but we've done it plenty of times where it was like, we're not even worried about freeing ourselves. We need to free the people who are really in power, which for us were the women. We couldn't make decisions in our society without the women council. So even in modern day tribal, our tribe, we have what we call the tribal council, which is of both sexes. And that kind of has like a general, like, okay, we'll make a couple of decisions, but we've always ran our decisions to an all woman council after that. And that's just because out of respect for all the women, women make more sound decisions than men. They might make emotional decisions a little bit quicker, but men make irrational decisions very fast. And so we had to pass it through women. We had to go through women and screen it through women when it comes to a lot of our decision making, because women always come with that even tone of decision making. And so we've always valued that, and they understood that, and that's why they devalued our women. And then we learned to devalue our own women, and that's pretty much the downfall of us. was us not valuing people who are of power, and women hold a lot of power in our society. And for us to do that was pretty much like suicide almost, for us to take on their practice of devaluing. And so it's trickled down to today with like street culture. It's trickled down today with like this whole like anti anything that's considered street culture, which is technically anti-indigenous now. And it's just a sad ongoing situation for us all. For me, the biggest way to help all this is for everybody to bring awareness to what true culture is and what false culture is. And yeah, that's pretty much the gist for me. I could go on a little bit further about details, but that's pretty much the gist of what's going on with this presentation.
All right, thank you so much, Stephen,
Yep.
for that wonderful talk. Can we get a round of applause? Does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, oh, sorry. So I have a couple
Mhm.
questions, but one, I just want to thank you for coming here, and it's really brave of you, and it's beautiful that you're able to share what your ancestors went through, what you went through, and what you continue to go through to this day. And it's really like courageous of you, because not many people have the ability to speak that.
Right.
And so a couple of my questions are, one is that I am so uneducated to the topic that you brought today.
Mhm.
And it amazes me that none of this is written in my history books or taught to me in my 6 years of history classes.
Mhm.
Instead, I'm learning about slavery in the South, which is still horrible, but I don't know anything about what happened to
Right here, yeah.
here. And it's like actually crazy to me that I have no education on what happened to your ancestors and you. And it's just like, I don't even know how to explain it. It's just crazy to me that none of this is written in the history books I've learned for 6 years. So,
Well, that's because they don't want anybody to know we exist. They don't even want anybody to know that we know our title. This is the biggest sham in our history, is the fact that they keep promoting that indigenous people don't exist on the continent, that we all died off from the cough or the sneeze or the measles or the mumps. And it's just not true. They couldn't exterminate us all. So they literally coalesced it and amalgamated us into their society. So they literally had to have physical sex with our women in order to eventually amalgamate everybody into society. They don't speak on it. Indians are like the big elephant in the room. No one ever speaks on us. And that's just the whole continent, not just California. I was just saying earlier, they don't even speak on the fact that there's 2 types of Indians. No one even knows this thing. No one knows that there's 2 different types of what we call indigenous people. There's people that have been on the continent from time memorial, and there's people that literally traveled from Asia. And the people that have been here know that we've been here. And just like we know the tribes that came from Asia, and they amalgamated with the original people, and then eventually made a whole new version of people before contact. But it doesn't pertain to us. They teach in school theory. They don't teach facts here. They never teach facts in any of the colleges. They never teach facts in any of the schools. It's all theory. And theory is thought. Theory is not fact. Theory is some guy who come up with his own conclusions and wrote a PDF file, and now they're teaching it at school, some random guy's thoughts on us, instead of teaching the actual facts and the first contact reports and the diaries and everything that was kept. They don't ever want nobody to read that stuff. And that's because once you have a sense of who you really are, not just me as indigenous, but who you are, everybody, there's no way you'll let this country push its genocidal consensus on any of this continent. And so they prevent us from knowing about each other. Just like they don't teach us about Celts. They don't teach us about Romans, really. They don't teach us about any of this ancient stuff. They don't want us to know. They don't want you to know. They don't want you to know. And anybody else in this room, they don't want you to know your history. You have to teach yourself. History is the biggest I tell my kids all the time, listen to everything in school except for history. You can listen to everything else in school. And even then, that's even questionable, but definitely don't listen to the history. I literally went to my daughter's elementary school because they were teaching the mission system in 4th grade. And my daughter, knowing who she was like, oh, I'm Ohlone. I'm Rumson Ohlone. My family's from Carmel Mission. And the teacher blatantly told her that she's not Ohlone, that Ohlone people don't exist. So how does that even like, I had to go down there and cause a ruckus, and I probably shouldn't have did it the way I did, but I did. And basically ruffled feathers and cursed people out, and I probably shouldn't have, but I'd be damned if someone tells my kid she doesn't exist, or that our ancestors don't exist, or that what she's saying was a lie. It was like, basically, you're calling my child a liar. And my child knows her own history at the age of, at the age of a 4th grader, 10, 9, 10, 11. And for you to just say, no, they don't exist, which means you don't exist. Obviously, you're ill educated. And we can prove lineage. So I end up not only going there the first day, but I went there the second day with tribal members and with documentation of our lineage, and basically stressed that you cannot teach this to anybody else. You cannot teach these falsehoods, and you definitely can't speak on someone's lineage if you don't know it. I can't tell you if you're telling me I'm Irish or English. I'm like, no, you're not. Who am I to tell you what you are? If you're telling me, I have to take it for face value. And so it wasn't. It's being us. It's very hard on multiple layers because we're marginalized. We're non-existent. I always tell people I'm a mastodon because they consider us extinct. So I'm like, I'm extinct. I don't exist. I don't exist in this world. I'm extinct. According to everybody, my people do not exist. So what am I then? If I don't exist, what am I? What title do I? And then that's a a mental. I don't even know what word to call it. It's just a mind game. And it's messed up. It's really messed up that someone could tell you you don't exist. And that goes for anybody. So I don't wish that upon anybody. I don't wish anybody's title to be stripped of them. If you know your title, learn it. Learn it in great detail. Learn who you are to the T. It's the best thing you could do. I know exactly who I am, not only through my lineage, but through like even my chart. I did all my charts, my zodiac, my Chinese, my this, my that, to figure out what energy encompassed my body when I was born. And that gave me great insight on how I operate as a male within this plane of existence now.
Thank you. And I don't think you caused a ruckus at all.
Yeah.
I think that's what a dad would do.
Yeah.
And then my second question is, you mentioned that you were in the foster care system until the age of 19. Did you, like, what happened after you were like 19 and you left the foster care system?
Well, I didn't leave. They technically gave me the boot. I maxed
Yeah.
out. And then
Yeah.
when you technically when you max out, they were supposed to help me, but they didn't. They gave me $350 as an adult, and I got out the system with $350 to my name. And I eventually lived with like a couple family members and just kind of like was a vagrant for a while until I really I chose to jump in the military because I had nothing else going on and I didn't know anything else but system. So I jumped in the military instead of being part of a victim in the prison system. So my brother ended up a year before I jumped in the military, he got caught for doing some crimes and he served 11 years and I did 4 years in the military. I did 4 years in the Marine Corps. That's what happened. I didn't know anything else but system work. So I jumped into another system. And then eventually realized that I was just being a pirate to my own people. And so I jumped out of the military and jumped into doing this type of work. And I just couldn't see myself killing us for natural resources. So it just didn't sit right with my soul to be in the military. So I got out of that and I jumped into like being more tribally involved, being more family orientated. I eventually had kids out of the military, but because of my PTSD throughout the system, I didn't know how to really conform to society. And so I've never really conformed to society. I've always made my own rules. And I've always like played by my own rules and it's kept me alive so far. But I've been in survival mode. And I tell that to my people all the time, my friends, that it sucks being in survival mode because I've never lived life. I've never had a relaxation time. I've never I don't ever think I ever had a time where I could kick up my feet and not stress about something. And I know people that are like, man, I have no care in the world. I'm like, geez, doesn't that feel good? Like, I've never had that. I've always been in a high stress level since birth. I was born 98% on drugs, and that's why I was snatched. And so my whole body's been at a state of constant stress since I was born. I'm just now realizing how to like kind of calm myself down and relax, but it's hard. It's still hard.
Well, thank you so much.
Mm.
And yeah, thank you.
Thanks. And if people want to educate themselves more,
Mhm.
do you have, well, obviously, do you have ways people can follow you personally or other sources that you think are more reliable than ones they're exposed to, I guess, as first? Like, how do people continue to be in conversation with you or learn from you? And
Sure.
then second, can people support you? Is there some way where people can get more involved in learning from you, supporting your work, or
Sure.
you know, financial support, stuff like that?
Yeah. The best way to contact me is probably through my social media, like Facebook or my Instagram. I'm a little bit more active on those. I go by my government name. So if you guys have the flyer, you could literally just look up my name and type it in, and it should pop up. Support. I mean, to me, your ears are enough support. I don't necessarily need any other support than people listening to the truth, and embracing the truth for what it is. But yes, you can, I mean, literally my government name. If you type in my government name, it's all over Facebook. It's on Instagram. And because I'm a public speaker, I don't like use a lot of crazy names. It's like it's there. I do have another name on my Instagram, but if you typed in just Stephen Arevalo, it should pop up. No, you guys are supporting enough. The fact that I'm here today doing this is enough support and awareness for me. There you go. There it is. As you can see, I do drop a lot of different, all my highlights on my page are like just deep downloads, deep breakdowns about culture, sacred energy exchange, native polygamy, the correlation of like Polynesian and indigenous cultures, the original term. There's a lot of stuff we don't really know of, but for instance, the N-word was originally applied to Native Americans, and a lot of people don't know that. That's originally applied to natives, and that's because natives were copper-colored people. So when we start talking about Aboriginals and we start talking about Mongoloids, in modern terms, we would call that Asian or Negro or Black. And so those are the basics of indigenous culture. And this is why when you look at Olmec sculptures and you look at certain Mayan sculptures and paintings, you see very, very dark people with dreadlocks in those Mayan paintings. You see very, very Negro features in the Olmec heads. There's definitely two different types of indigenous people. And like I said, I could physically show you like on my phone later, like the physical descriptions just in Monterey. And they know. And even the paintings, 1816 paintings, you see, Black Indians with dreadlocks in San Francisco, but they never teach it. And then when they do all this information at like Golden Gate Park, they always have somebody redraw. They never use the original paintings. It's always a redrawn version. And for some reason, it's always some Asian looking Indian. And it's like, that's just not what we looked like. So proper context, proper information, proper drawings and things like that would help. Descriptions would help. But again, they're hiding everything. Every 10 years, they change our name and our title. So our original title is Kakunta. That's our actual title. But now we're Esselen, Ohlone, Rumsen. These are all titles just given upon us. Costanoan, Carmeleño, Costaño. Every decade, they change our title. So that's why whenever I post on my page, I hashtag every title that they ever thrown on us. Whether it be the 2 different versions of Rumsen, the 5 different versions of Esselen that they've misspelled, because they do it on purpose. If I take out an extra S and put in an E, well, now that's a whole new title for them. And so that's how they keep us at a state of ignorance on our own culture and our own land titles and lineages.
Okay. So what name of your tribe do you use like with your family and things like that?
Amongst my family, we say kakunta,
Okay.
but for everybody else who doesn't know that language, we just say we're Southern Ohlone. Because they're split between northern tribes and southern tribes. And so even amongst the Ohlone community, a lot of descendants don't know a lot of these terms. There's descendants have only gone from what their moms told them. And 2 generations back, they don't have the information that we have now.
Mhm.
It's our generation now that's bringing forward these original diaries and Father Sarah's diary, Portola's diary. None of them were reading that before that. They didn't have access to the internet or PDF files, or they would have to go to the Mormon churches to even get the genealogy back then. So like my mom was one of them. My mom used to go to the temple in Oakland to look up every record ever given California history. And so we did the physical paper trail. Now my mom started that maybe, I want to say 30 years ago. I was 6 when she started doing it. I didn't start helping her till I was like 25, but we have 4,726 people in our family tree now. Due diligence, literally physical paperwork for paperwork, not DNA, not spitting in a tube. That's not going to tell you who you are, because it'll pop up as European, but what they're not telling you is there's already European blood on the continent. There's already African blood on the continent pre-contact. So when they start breaking it down by DNA, it's all BS. And if you look at the fine print of all those DNA companies, they say we're 0.001% accurate, which means they're just throwing darts in the dark. They really can't tell you what you are. DNA is only used for criminal and paternal cases only. Doesn't even have legal standing. 23andMe holds no weight in court. You cannot use that and say, well, I should be part of the tribe because my paperwork, my 23andMe says I'm 50% Cherokee. That will not hold up in court. You have to prove from when you're born all the way through village site in order to prove your lineage. There cannot be not one gap. And so we've had, I don't know if I call them pretendians, but we've had people falsify documentation to try to get benefits to being us. But like literally it'll be like 1 year off, and it takes like we have a committee that actually goes through people's lineages and finds that stuff out and figures out if you're really one of us or if you're not. And it's important because especially in modern times, it's so trendy to be Indian right now. It's so trendy to burn sage. And so you got people that are just falsifying documents and people that are making 501(c)s based on indigenous culture. That it's just a nonprofit. You're not even doing anything but building a nonprofit and stealing culture and then calling yourself an Indian tribe with no lineage attached to it. And so we're dealing with that within our own communities now. We're dealing with this trendy Indian movement, and people really literally stealing our identity right now for resources, for money. And Indians already don't get that much money, especially if you're not federally recognized. You're already on the rough end of the stick. And so to try to like claim us and then take resources from whatever little resources we have, it's just like, it's crazy.
Yeah.
And that's what's going on right now.
Thank you.
Yep.
I was just going to invite everybody to dinner. We do have to close out to transition over to the Green Music Hall for dinner. If
Okay.
you're coming to dinner at 7, the tickets are out there. So just a reminder.
So have you ever been like discriminated against in the workplace or based on like your tribe, like your tattoos and stuff? Have you ever been not allowed to get a job, or has someone ever discriminated against you based on your
On my culture and look? No, not necessarily off that. I actually get the opposite effect now. Because it's trendy. Like everybody wants to hire an Indian now. It's really weird. But like, especially because I live within like my not necessarily traditional homeland, but within Ohlone territory. So because I'm Ohlone within Ohlone territory, it's like, oh, we got an Ohlone, like let's actually hire him. It's actually the opposite effect. Before I actually went through my rites of passages with my tribal markings and I just had like street tattoos, that's when I was discriminated on because I
really?
didn't fit the build of a native by tradition.
Yeah.
I fit the build of a gang member because of my street tattoos.
right?
And because I was young and decided to ink up my body with like it's not even gang stuff. Like if I
Yeah.
showed you my arm, you'd be like, yo, you have a Nintendo controller and and a pencil on your arm. It's
Yeah.
like, but to them, it's the style of art that it is. And so because it looks like prison art, it's considered gang art.
Right.
And so no matter what, when I'm out and about in San Francisco, I'm a gang member to everybody who doesn't know. But people that are in that culture, like he's totally not a gang member. Like
Yeah.
this guy is not part of us. So you get stuck in between, especially when you're from a certain demographic, but you're not part of that particular culture. You just happen to be foreign in that demographic. Not everybody that lives in the hood is a gang member. That's the biggest misconception, is that like just because we're all poor and we're all in this impoverished area with high crime, that we're all criminals. That's
Right.
just not true. Some of us are, some of us aren't. And it's not to say anything bad about anybody from any bad neighborhood. It's just I can't come to the suburbs and say everybody's a nerd.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Everybody's really good at school and they do their homework.
Yeah.
It's not true.
No, I'm from the suburb. It's not true.
Totally not true. Yeah, there's all kinds of riffraff everywhere. It doesn't matter. Just like there's crime out here, there's crime down there. It's just glorified down there. And really what it is just a lack of resources. And what a lack of resources, if you're starving, you will do whatever it takes to eat, right?
Right.
Thou shalt not, they say, don't steal, but you're going to steal food if you have to survive. And then, so that's what's really happening in those areas. It's like, we know better. People that are impoverished know better, but when you have a lack of resources, a lack of food, a lack of job, you start to do things to survive. And that's really what goes on in those impoverished areas. And so being from an impoverished area, I totally understand that and how that works. And I don't judge any of it. You know what I mean? It just is what it is. Some of us do it, some of us don't. Some of us live righteous, some of us don't. And that comes in many forms, fashions, and demographics.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope you guys, and thank you, Stephen, for your talk.
Thank you.
I also did not know a lot of like what you had to share today. And thank you for that. And I hope you guys have a great day and that you guys can join at the Green Music Center for some food at 7. And yeah, thank you again, Stephen.
Thank you. All righty.